It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Let's show through the force of our ideas, the strength of our commitment, that Labour will govern again. Let's get on with it.
John Prescott, Deputy Prime Minister during the new Labour years, dies at the age of 86.
He was loyal, committed, an enormous help to me, and he had a fantastic gut instinct about politics.
Also today, Russia reportedly fires a ballistic missile after Ukraine uses UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles.
Be in no doubt that the UK government is stepping up our support for Ukraine.
A new Conservative leader. So is the only way up for Kemi Badenoch and her party? This former Conservative cabinet minister isn't so sure. We'll discuss her new book. And more hotels like this one in Greater Manchester are being used to house asylum seekers. We speak to a local resident.
It's difficult to say whether I agree or disagree with what's happening because we're just being left in the dark.
With me today, Labour MP Mike Tapp, Conservative MP Patrick Spencer, former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries and author and Mirror journalist Susie Boniface. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Well, we all woke up to the news this morning that the former Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott passed away at the age of 86. He was a pivotal, larger-than-life figure during the new Labour years and has been called a titan of the Labour movement as tributes have been flooding in all morning. Not long ago, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, paid his own tribute to John Prescott in the House of Commons.
We woke today to the deeply sad news that we've lost a true giant of the Labour movement and of this House, a man who fought for working-class ambition because he lived it. As one of the key architects of a Labour government, John achieved that rare thing. He changed people's lives and he set the path for us all to follow.
Give us a sense, Mike, of his importance to the Labour movement and that point made by the Prime Minister that he represented the aspirations of working-class people.
Yeah, and I think Keir hit the nail on the head, really, and it is really sad waking up today to this news. And, you know, Alzheimer's is a devastating disease, but, you know, we've got to move into that celebration of his life, and I think that's really important. And already the WhatsApp groups are awash with stories of his sort of man of the people approach, really. There was one that I picked up on today where he came out of hospital and actually then had those that are caring for him come into Parliament for a tour. Another where he threw a party for the cleaners in Parliament at 5 a.m. in the morning for Christmas. So he truly did touch people's lives, and he's a lovely man.
Susie, your reflections? I mean, he was straight-talking, he was a bit of a bruiser, and he was really rather different to Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Peter Mandelson.
Yeah, journalists loved him because you could always get something out of John Prescott, and he always just did things, events that happened around him. But he was a real contradiction because he had this reputation, you know, the punched in the general election campaign, being a political bruiser and all this, and he spent almost his entire time in Parliament being a peacemaker between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. You know, he was the demilitarised zone between the two. He was old Labour, but yet he was part of that whole new Labour project. And I think it's interesting the fact that we as humans, we want to say that people are one particular thing. And there's always so much more to it. They are much, much more complex than that. And what John Prescott did for Labour and for the government and as an MP is going to be something that is going to be a matter of history because people could write entire books about it.
What about your reflections? Obviously, different party, opposite end of the political spectrum, but what about John Prescott in terms of the person he was?
Well, you know, he was big in Westminster when I arrived, and he was a giant, and you don't get people like John Prescott anymore in politics.
You don't think you do?
No, I think, so from when I've been in Westminster for 25 years, but as an MP I was there for almost 19 years, And I think, and it sounds like just like an old woman comment, doesn't it? But I just think the politics of those early years when I was there with people like John Prescott, the speeches, the narration, and everybody was aware that John Prescott's main role was as the peacemaker between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who appeared, both were, again, you know, titans of politics, but both absolutely hated each other. And it was him who kept the show on the road, really. I don't think he got enough credit for that.
Well, we're seeing pictures there of the three of them, Gordon Brown, John Prescott and Tony Blair. What about for you, Patrick Spencer? A different era, of course, of politics.
Not at all. When I started getting into politics as a kid, it was during the 90s, and he was a huge figure then, and he remains now. You know, I've arrived in Parliament in 2024, and his shadow, his presence is still felt. He's a quintessential British character from public life, someone who represents the very best, having grown up in a working class background and having risen to be Deputy Prime Minister. But at the same time, you know, in a slightly cruel British way, you know, his legacy will be perhaps about his penchant for luxury cars and misbehaviour. Somewhat unfair, but still, look, he's huge, he's massive, and he will be missed by everyone across the House.
Well, I think we can show some of the pictures. It was pretty infamous during the 2001 election. Susie referenced it. There it is. He was pelted with an egg while he was on the campaign trail, and you can see clearly here him swing that punch. I seem to remember afterwards Tony Blair being asked about it, Susie, and saying, well, John is John.
Yeah, and it's one of those contradictions. Like I said, we remember him for that sort of outburst of violence, which, like Nadine's right, you would never have a politician ever sort of trying to do that. It wouldn't happen. They would all be far more controlled, I think. But by the same token, all those accusations we had of him, of hypocrisy, of the two Jags, and yet he was, you know, integral with writing the Kyoto Protocol and getting climate change on the political agenda in the UK. Those photographs of him playing croquet at Dorneywood, yes. You know, like he's not a man of the people. And actually, you know, where he was and where he came from, it didn't make him a hypocrite. He was just, you know, he had aspired and he had reached, and he was that inspirational figure for a lot of people.
I mean, Tony Blair said that he reached parts of the Labour movement that he couldn't himself, and that a big part of John Prescott's appeal was his working class background, a ship steward, a trade union activist. Do you think Parliament has fewer people like that, from that sort of background, but you think of Angela Rayner, for example, in the Labour Party, or not?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think there are people just going into politics from the wrong backgrounds and the wrong reasons. People who've just gone through, you know, done politics at universities, worked as PR or researchers in Westminster and gone straight into being MPs. I don't think it's that we don't have enough people who understand the backgrounds. It's just that there is too many going through this machine. And, you know, we have MPs in Westminster now and I've seen this transformation happen, it was a very collegiate place years ago, but now MPs come in with smartphones and Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts and Instagram accounts, and it's very much about the number of likes and what they're saying. If you look at the debates that used to take place in Westminster, the questions that used to be asked on the floor of the House during question time, and look at it now, it's all about the moment to go on Instagram or the moment to put onto Twitter. It's very much distorted the kind of MP we have and the way they develop their career.
Two new MPs.
It's an interesting point, and I agree with some of it. Look, from my own point of view, I grew up watching New Labour and the likes of John Prescott, and you know, I came from a family. My dad was a copper, my mum was a care worker, and it was people like John that made me realise that, hey, potentially in the future, this sort of opportunity could be open to me. That then was parked, and I went on to serve with the military, etc. But you know, it is important to have those types of politicians who are interested in service and also are normal people, which he clearly was.
Patrick, do you recognise the description by Nadine? I've
been here for not very long, so I'll reserve the criticism of people in the House and people in the party. I will say this, though. It's not particularly new for us to complain about the calibre of people coming into politics. That's gone on for generations. That's true. What I would say, though, is, for me, the importance, the best politicians, they're absolutely, as Nadine, and Nadine was emblematic of this, independently minded. and absolutely infatuated about serving their constituents. And I think those two things I really look for in people in the House. It's what I'm hopefully going to, do in my career, is serve the people who elected me and remain independent to a certain extent.
Let's talk about something completely different, because you will have heard also overnight, if we show you this BBC News headline, that Ukraine fires UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles at Russia for the first time. We've been talking about this for the last few days because it comes off the back of reports of strikes from Ukraine into Russia from US-supplied Atacm missiles at Russian territory. Now, the government here has refused to comment on the reports that British missiles have been fired for operational reasons, but officials confirmed the Defence Secretary John Healey spoke to his Ukrainian counterpart on Tuesday night, and there will be caution exercised for all the obvious reasons. But let me show you this headline, BBC News. Kyiv says Russia fired intercontinental ballistic missile in Ukraine attack. There has been an expectation of a response from the Kremlin, and Kyiv says that it would mark the first attack from such a weapon in almost 3 years of war. Let me just get your reaction to that news overnight. Mike?
Yeah, look, it's over 1,000 days since Putin waged war on Ukraine, and they've done a fantastic job in repelling that. But our support is steadfast, and we will not waver on that. It's really important that we supply Ukraine with the aid that they need, and as you've seen, and we've increased that to 3 billion, also 300 million for ammunition, and 2.26 billion loan from Russian sanctions, or backed by Russian sanctions, and that support is vital. On operational matters, it's also very important that we don't play into the hands of Vladimir Putin and let him know exactly what we're doing. That's one of the first rules of war.
Patrick?
I mean, clearly this issue transcends politics. We are looking down the barrel at the most dangerous situation the globe has seen since perhaps the end of the Cold War. We're all united behind Ukraine. We all want to see the right outcome, and I'm sure the government will bring forth a strategy to make sure we're doing our absolute utmost to make sure we push back against Putin.
All right, well, let's just have a listen to the Defence Secretary John Healey being asked about this.
While the Ukrainian actions on the battlefield speak for themselves, Mr. Chairman, be in no doubt that the UK government is stepping up our support for Ukraine, determined to continue doubling down our support for Ukraine. I won't be drawn on the operational details of the conflict. It risks both operational security, and in the end, the only one that benefits from such a public debate is President Putin.
But of course, the Kremlin has warned of escalation, and the unconfirmed reports of this ballistic missile can be seen through that prism. What are your thoughts about fears of more what we call hybrid warfare?
I think we have to think about the reason why some of this is happening. So Ukraine has pushed into Russian territory, into the Kursk region, took about 400 square miles of territory. That was very bad news for Putin. He's managed to claw back about half of that. But whoever holds some part of that Kursk region, when it comes around to Christmas, when we get to Donald Trump being in the White House and maybe starts peace negotiations, then you have that person is going to have that upper hand. And so Ukraine is desperate to have some part of Kursk stilled in order to help that talks, whereas Putin wants it all back for simple reasons. Now, I think probably the reason that we have allowed some Storm Shadow may be connected to the fact that we expect this to dial down fairly quickly through no fault of our own, that Trump is going to intercede at some point. And I suspect as well that what Putin's doing by firing an ICBM is to say, look, I'm still, I'm saber rattling, I'm still a fairly big boy, but I'm not going to go right up to the top here. I'm going to show you what I can do. There's clearly no need for an ICBM to be fired from one country into a neighbouring
ballistic
country.
Missile,
It's not an intercontinental issue. I would suspect some of that may be about, not just about posturing, but about whether or not the Allies were aware that Putin had an ICBM nearby and was able to use it in that way, and whether they actually had eyes on it at the time. That would be something that I'd be worried about in government.
What about the response from the government, listening to John Healey saying we're not going to talk about these things for operational reasons?
Well, I understand that, and that will have been, you know, I've been in a number of strap room briefings myself over the years, and I think that will have been on very specific advice from both the security services and people like Admiral Sir Tony Radkin and MI5 and others. And, you know, the government is made up of just politicians who come from a variety of backgrounds, and I think that when it comes to issues like a potential war or dealing with a war which is ongoing, you look to the experts who are the security services and MI5 and you take their advice. And I think not poking the bear, not riling up Putin anymore, whilst is probably a good thing. You know, Keir Starmer stood at the dispatch box announcing that we're going to send the Shadow Storm missiles in. It's going to lead the news. It's going to lead of the front pages of the newspapers, and Putin sees that. And I think that just is like throwing more oil on the fire. So I think, on the one hand, I think it's a shame that, you know, that Starmer hasn't gone to Westminster and announced this to MPs. But I also think we need to look at this in context, in a much bigger picture. And maybe he's doing that because he's being advised not to do that.
Well, you mentioned Tony Radkin, Admiral Sir Tony Radkin. If we show this headline of a piece that he's written, he's advising that the UK gets resilient, like Sweden and some of the Baltic states, which are obviously much closer geographically to Russia, to prepare for war, he says. The Chief of the Defence Staff says Britain needs to learn from Nordic and Baltic countries and plan for the country's defence. What do you think he means? What does that say to you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and something that prior to politics I was saying when I was working with the MOD and in the military, that it's the Baltic states that are the experts on this issue. It's the threat on their border. And I've just constituted the APPG for Estonia. And a part of the reason for that is to... my apologies.
Right. No.
And a part of the reason for that is to ensure that these small nation states do have a voice and that they are listened to, and they must be defended.
Yes, but what does it mean, get resilient? I mean, what's he actually talking about, do you think, Patrick?
I don't know the specifics around civil readiness, but I would say this. I think this is an opportunity for us to think super long term about our role on the international stage and what our military means to us as a country, because, and it's across all parties, there has been a step back and a reduction in spending over time as we've diverted money from national defence to, since the end of the Cold War, from national defence to social protection programmes. And that probably now has to change as we get real and understand a real threat to our way of life.
But it could also be a frustration, you know, on the 2.5. So Labour have said they're going to increase their spending to 2, but they won't say when.
Absolutely.
And this could come from a point of frustration of you need to say when, because the forces can't plan. Susie will know this better than me. They can't plan, they can't buy, they can't spend, they can't project what they're going to do in the future until they know how much money they're going to have.
So what I was saying is the Conservatives had 14 years to meet that spending commitment, and they didn't. We've said we will, but when fiscally responsible to do so, and that's
Ukraine.
Really important. And
we didn't have a real war taking place.
You've got to also bear in mind. You've got to also bear in mind that we are conducting a strategic defence review as we speak, and that will help us inform exactly where that money goes.
Well,
and that will be completed.
All this stuff is 10 years down the road, and wherever Tony Radkin says, we are not resilient and able to insulate ourselves from foreign events, because if Putin went into Ukraine and our fuel prices went through the roof, that kind of planning takes 20, 30 years, and successive governments of every party failed to do that.
And that is why we are conducting this review now. We've just mothballed some ships that were never going to see service, and you've got some Conservative MPs talking negatively on that. But, you know, we are looking to the future about how we become more agile with our forces to defend against threats such as Russia.
Just on that, I saw that statement, and I can understand why you may see it as disappointing, but we are all concerned and confused as to why there is time and space given to announcing the mothballing of equipment, and there doesn't seem to be much intention on what we're going to spend and invest on going forward.
Patience. We need to conduct the review before we make these announcements. And I know that, you know, in the social media age, people want information now, but we do have to wait for that.
I mean, there has been this ongoing discussion about spending, and actually, Patrick is right that the peace dividend seems to be over. That sort of crossover of spending a large, or certainly a more significant proportion of our GDP on defence has, you know, swapped at the end of the Cold War, and now these are the questions that are being raised about spending on defence. But are people willing to take that on, Susie, when it comes to the sort of money that perhaps would need to be spent? 2.5% by 2030, what the Conservatives were saying, but they didn't spend anything like that until much more recently. Are they aware, do you think?
I don't think they are. I think they're used to this kind of talk as well, because there's reviews and spending and cutbacks, and it's the same thing we've heard. I was a defence reporter under the last Blair government, the Brown's government, and they were talking about cutbacks and mothballing ships then. Then they had a strategic defence review. They created Albion and Bulwark, these two landing ships, which have been mothballed by the Tories and have now been scrapped by Labour. The threat has changed, but they're only 20 years old.
You can't expect us to use the old defence review, surely.
No, they have had another 10 years in them yet, and they've been mothballed by one party, they've been axed by another party. The ships to replace them are another decade away. And every party, every government said, we're going to stop spending so much on defence. Oh, it's a bit too expensive. And at the same time, have allowed the MOD to be spending 80 grand on a spanner and wasting God knows how much.
But there's a new dynamic.
Our forces are the smallest since Napoleon days, and we need to address what we've inherited, and that's what we'll be doing in government.
Let me just interject, because we have some breaking news on an important story. BBC News headline here: arrest warrants. Their arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court have been issued for Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant and Hamas commander over alleged war crimes. Now, this had been discussed at some length. What's your response in terms of what the UK government will do? Because what it means is that if the UK government supports this, if any of them were to come to the UK, they'd be arrested.
And Keir Starmer will sit with his lawyers now to ensure that we come up with the right response to this. I can't preempt that sitting here in the studio, but what I can say is that Hamas conducted this awful attack on the 7th of October, this terrorist atrocity. They must release the prisoners, which are still being held this hundreds of days since October the 7th. And at the same time, we're calling for that immediate ceasefire and a two-state solution. That's really important.
What's your reaction, Patrick, to equating the Israeli Prime Minister and former Defence Minister with the Hamas commander in terms of alleged war crimes?
I can't actually better what Mike said, although I'm a bit nervous about the notion of a two-state solution at the moment. I'm not going to comment on the idea of an arrest warrant. I definitely don't equate Benjamin Netanyahu with the Hamas leadership. The Hamas leadership, they're a terrorist organisation. Yep. And what they did on October 7th of last year is nothing short of a terrorist attack on a Western way of life. And we should be doing absolutely everything we can to eradicate Hamas and bring an end to the war, because and this is my point about two-state solution, is two-state, if you did put in place a two-state solution, the majority of people in Palestine would want to retain some form of Hamas.
I'm a strong advocate for a two-state solution, but not for terrorist organisations. Hamas need to go.
Hamas needs to go, for sure.
Let's return to our discussion on defence, because, Susie, you have completed a documentary, a very important documentary. Tell us about it, because it is concerning British nuclear testing after the war in Australia.
Yeah, quite opposite, really, considering what's happening today. So it was on BBC Two last night. It's on iPlayer for another year. It's called Britain's Nuclear Bomb Scandal, Our Story. And it covers, really, a story that I've been working on at the Mirror for about 20 years, which the Mirror's campaigned on for 40 years, which is proper recognition of what happened to our servicemen who were used in nuclear weapons tests in the Cold War. Now, lots of people, when they hear it, they go, oh, yeah, I know something about that. I've heard something about that. And then it's kind of been resolved. There are 10% of these men still alive. They have 155,000 descendants who report 10 times the normal rate of birth defects. And for the past 70 years, the British government has said, well, we didn't use them in an experiment. They just happened to be nearby and they were fine. Last year, we managed to prove through Freedom of Information requests that the Atomic Weapons Establishment has got at least 4,000 pages of evidence about blood and urine testing of those men at the time, which are not in their medical records and have been withheld from them ever since. Now, that's a crime. We've also found in the documentary that aired last night that current serving and very senior Whitehall officials gave false testimony to courts repeatedly under oath in the European Court for Human Rights and the Supreme Court and the High Court that these blood tests didn't exist.
I mean,
now, again, that's a crime.
It is an extraordinary documentary. Let's just hear from one of the British veterans whose ship went through the mushroom cloud.
The mission of the ship was to sail into the toxic fallout of the nuclear blast, to follow directly as it moves.
There is no doubt that the British government intentionally put men in harm's way.
I was used. Everybody on that ship were used. You weren't given a choice in this, and if that's not being used, tell me what is. If the MOD are honest, they would say that.
What about compensation, Mike and Patrick?
Yeah, it's a really touching report you've got there, and thank you, Susie, for the work that you've done on this and the Mirror. It's been a fantastic campaign, and I'm glad to see that criteria for medals on the US test sites has been widened, and it's squadron leader Pete Peters received that the other day from Al Cairns, our Veterans Minister, and I'm really happy about that. On compensation, I can't make those decisions myself, sat here, of course. But what I will say is that obviously Al is looking at this, John Healy's looking at this, and it's something that is being taken forward and considered.
A good example, by the way, of the importance of the media, but also the importance of parliamentarians, because I know Sir John Hayes has been quite an instrumental figure in this. And when you've got a member of Parliament who is independent, who isn't spending their entire time on social media, it's incredible what they can achieve. And all credit to you, Susie, all credit to everyone who's involved in this campaign, bring to light such a critical injustice.
The fact is, and the difficult thing to deal with, is that, as I report in the Mirror today, the possible bill could top £5 billion. Now, that legal action, which is been taken by veterans now, which is basically for injury by government, injury as a result of cover-up, went to the last government in March. It was repeated to the Labour government in September, and they still, although they have, John Healy said this morning, there is an internal investigation underway, they've still not engaged with the veterans' lawyers at all. And so there's an offer for a much, much cheaper way of doing this, a special one-year tribunal to cap the cost, bring it down under £5 billion, save the taxpayer and the MOD some money, and give these men the answers they deserve. Archie there is 86, 87, right? And he's had 60 years of ill health, and he deserves to have some answers sooner rather than later.
All right, let's talk about the Conservative Party and the new Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch. She's only been in the post for a few weeks, but you, Nadine Dorries, haven't exactly pulled your punches about Kemi Badenoch in the past. There she is, actually being announced as leader. What do you think of her now? Now she's in post and in her first few weeks.
Well, so it's no secret that Kemi wasn't my choice for leader, and people who read my book, The Plot, and read my new book, Downfall, know that that's the case and the reasons why. But, you know, I'm a Conservative. I've had to do a bit of inward reflection at the moment, actually, because I always criticised Labour MPs who went out and campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. I didn't understand how they could do that. But I find myself in the position now of believing that it's actually your principles and your party that come first. And, you know, my membership... Well, I respect the vote of the members. And for me, that is important.
But your books...
And if the members have elected Kemi Badenoch to be leader of the Conservative Party, then from here on in, she will have my loyalty, because that's who the membership have chosen.
Right.
And
but I mean, in your book, you say part of the issue is that the Conservative Party on every level is in the gutter.
Yeah, well, there are chapters in that book which demonstrate the reason why. And things have to change. And one of my concerns with Kemi is that the group of people, and we all know who they are now, you know, when I brought The Plot out, there were MPs literally going on camera saying Dougie Smith's a figment of imagination. He doesn't.
You have said is responsible.
And he was being written about as a mainstream figure in the Sunday Times this week. So it's Dominic Cummings. There were a group of people who were together, and they've removed every Prime Minister since David Cameron in one way or another. And my point was, you know, forget the fact, you know, forget the group sex parties that take place in Portcullis House and the WhatsApp threads and other things which are detailed in the book. My issue is this, fundamentally, unless Kemi can cut the boat adrift from those people, unless those people can be removed from the Conservative Party, unless we can have a candidates department that works effectively and selects the kind of people that we want to be MPs and does it in a straight and honest and transparent way, and unless we develop policies and we run the party in an honest way, then I just don't see anything other than the chaos which has beset the party since 2016.
Do you agree with that characterisation, Patrick?
Funny enough, no, I don't entirely. I do accept that what happened before the last general election, the last Parliament, was nothing short of disgraceful at times. I think
when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, when Liz Truss was Prime Minister?
Well, there were not just that, but there were a number of Conservative MPs who had the whip taken off them. There are a number of them who have ended up in criminal proceedings. Like, there was clearly a massive breakdown in the way that the Conservative Parliamentary Party behaved. Now, do I think it's rotten to the core? No, I don't. I am one of 26 new Conservative MPs. We're 1/5 of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. I feel, like many other people do, that the Conservative Party has turned a new leaf. I believe Kemi is actually very popular with the Parliamentary Party. Everyone is behind her. I think she's popular with her with our members. And I feel like
we've unpopular in the country. So
well,
how are you ever going to win?
No.
Well, it's early days.
It's early days. It's super unfair to go around looking at polls saying, well, is she up, is she down, how does she compare to this person or that person? The fact of the matter is, I think, out with the old, in with the new, and to a certain extent, we have a chance to re-establish our relationship with the British public.
Right. And that responsibility rests on the shoulders of Patrick and other MPs who come in and have a clear view of what happened in the past and know where the party needs to go in the future. Because, as Patrick and I discussed before we came on this show today, the political stage is now being filled by Nigel Farage, actually. And I do make the point that that's because Boris Johnson has exited. But Nigel Farage and Reform are very organised and getting more organised by the day. We've got Liberal Democrats with 70-plus seats. We've got 121 MPs in the Conservative Party. These guys have a big job on their shoulder to make sure the Conservative Party survives.
Reform could become the new party on the right, replace the Conservatives?
The one thing I always said about Boris Johnson was he straddled the policy, the spectrum. He had, levelling up and net zero at the same time as he had Brexit over on the right and other right-wing policies. So he managed to have a policy breadth. Reform is not just right of centre, it's even further right than that. It's the reason why, if we had just a left-wing party, Jeremy Corbyn would have been Prime Minister. If it was right, Nigel Farage would have been Prime Minister a long time ago.
What do you do about reforms? You say Kemi Badenoch, you're going to put the past criticism, and there's much of it, about Kemi Badenoch behind you.
You have to be clear, that book is a book of interviews with former Cabinet ministers and ministers who
You're not a fan, were you, of Kemi Badenoch, or supported the idea of her becoming...
That's a fair comment.
Right, becoming leader. So what I'm saying is, if you think it's in such a desperate situation in the Conservative Party, and you're obviously missing Boris Johnson being leader of the Conservative Party,
communicator.
What do you do about Reform and Farage?
Well, you need to ask that question, Patrick, really.
And it's a really important question because, in my opinion, the Conservative Party lost the last election, Labour didn't win it. And we lost it because a load of people who traditionally vote Conservative didn't vote for us. They either voted for Reform or they didn't vote at all. But when you talk to our voters, when you talk to our members, when you talk to people who are annoyed with the Conservative Party, it wasn't because we weren't right-wing enough, and it wasn't because we were too left-wing. It was because our behaviour and our standards in public office were so underwhelming.
And also, Patrick, you don't know what the people...
I'm not going to get into a blame game, and I'm not going to start picking out individuals. But what I will say is there was an institutional collapse, if you will, for the Conservative Party. But... we've got to get back to communicating, and we've got to get back to...
Well, all right, well, let me put that to Mike. You wouldn't have... you didn't win the general election. You did win it.
We won a landslide victory.
It's widened...
Hang on. Let Mike...
Government built on...
They won a pretty stunning majority.
In Dover and Dale, how many reforms...
I've sat here and let the Conservatives battle it out amongst themselves, so if you don't mind... Look, we were in a similar position to the Conservative Party with Jeremy Corbyn, and for the record, I would not have stood under Jeremy Corbyn. We reset. We looked outwards to the country, to what voters wanted and needed. That's how we campaigned. That's how we're governing. Conservatives can carry on as they are.
Do you want to intrude on private grief for a moment, Susie? Listening,
sitting here trying not to laugh out loud at all of you. You can blame a cabal in politics. You can blame misbehaviour by MPs, or you could say that Labour did brilliantly in the election. The fundamental reason that I think the Tories lost and they now have a problem is they spent far too long listening to a very narrow section of society which forms their party, which picked Liz Truss and which has picked Kemi Badenoch, and I don't respect those choices at all. And if you really want to know what went totally wrong under the previous government, I would tell you that when I went to see Boris Johnson with the nuclear veterans and I showed him the first evidence of crimes being committed by the state, of blood tests of servicemen which are being hidden from them, and he did nothing about it. Boris Johnson not reporting a crime, quelle surprise. That's why we are where we are.
Nadine?
Well, I would say probably every leader, and you don't seem to be getting much response now either. And I would say there are, just to ask you if you don't mind, but it seems to me there are parallels between the infected blood inquiry and what happened in infected blood as well.
So Grenfell and Hillsborough,
and that took a very long time to bring. And I know this because I chaired part of the inquiry. It took a very long time to get to the point where anything happened there. But so, you know, I understand all of the points of view, but what I would say this, Mike, to you particularly, there are seats that were held by Conservative MPs for a considerable amount of time that were won by Labour in this election, where Reform are now polling higher.
Well,
I think reform is a danger, Mike, not just to the Conservative Party moving forward.
I don't disagree.
It's also a danger to the Labour Party.
Look, I am in Dover and Deal, for example. I've got a 7,500 majority, but I do respect those that
I think it's in your
reform.
seat, actually.
And I think it's, I very much doubt that. It's really important that we take on the issues that matter to those voters, and we are, and I think we're going to talk more about it later, but we're not ignoring the case of needing to secure the border after inherited open borders from the Conservative Party. You know, it's something that Keir Starmer's taken on as a top priority, and that's really important.
Well, we are going to talk about it. We're going to talk about asylum hotels because in the Labour manifesto in the election, there was a pledge to close asylum hotels, admittedly without a date. But actually, the number of hotels being used to house asylum seekers has risen by 7 since the general election. The government has disclosed the figures. Home Office Minister Dame Angela Eagle told MPs that 220 hotels were now in use, with 14 opened and 7 closed since the general election. Now, earlier today, I spoke to Gwyneth Roper from Altrincham in Greater Manchester. She lives near a hotel that is now being used to house asylum seekers, and I started by asking her to explain the situation in her area.
We only found out about the situation the night before the asylum seekers came into the hotel. And that was by rumours and things being put on social media. And straight away, we had residents arrive there. My main concern is the lack of clarity, the lack of information, possibly the lack of assessments prior to them arriving. And it's difficult to say whether I agree or disagree with what's happening because we're just being left in the dark.
It's amazing that there was no consultation whatsoever. So you literally hadn't been told that this was going to happen in your local area?
Not at all. And indeed, it was only after residents started to arrive that there were any meetings where the locals could go and find out more about it.
What would you like to see happen now?
I would like to, number one, I'd like to stop all this shouting at each other and sit down and the Home Office give us some answers. I've written twice to the Home Office. I sent an email to Yvette Cooper that just came back and said she doesn't answer questions unless you're a constituent. Please send it to this email address, which is wewillignoreyou.com. And I would like them to come up with some answers to say what assessments they've done to make sure the asylum seekers are safe and are processed fairly speedily, that the residents are safe, that there's safeguarding for the schools, 15 schools within walking distance of the hotel, the rationale for choosing that hotel, and not letting the police know, not letting the council know before, although I did look at a council meeting last night, and the head of the council actually was informed on the 8th of October, but nobody else apparently knew until the night before they arrived.
Should local residents like Gwyneth Roper be consulted and told, or even the police and the council, about changes to hotels being closed and for housing asylum seekers?
Well, it appears that the council were informed, but what I'll say on this is I do sympathise with the last guest, and we have to be clear on why this is happening. In 2018, there was just 300 boat crossings. Since then, we've had over 140,000 with record backlogs in the Home Office and spending £8 million a day on 400 hotels. That was all what we inherited. It's only been a few months, but we have got a plan in place to combat this. We've set up the Border Security Command to take on the gangs. We've got more decision makers in the Home Office, which is really important, because if we speed up the decisions, we don't need to use hotels.
Yeah, but I'm asking about consultation. Should people be consulted when these things happen in their area?
Well, I think in that, I can't comment on that individual case because I don't know the full details, but it was said there that the council were informed.
Well, but they didn't inform. It was the first that local people actually heard. And Gwyneth Roper went on to say, she says, I want all the shouting to stop. And that's because people were left in the dark, as she said. Is that right?
I think, look, the Home Office priority is speeding up the processing, deporting those who shouldn't be here. We've had 3 record flights off the ground. We've deported 10,000 in just this short period of time. If we do that, then we won't need these hotels. So that's the main effort of the Home Office at the moment.
But you admit, you promised to close them and actually the number's gone up.
Well, look, you know, we inherited 400 that were open. I mean, under Chris Phipps, there was just 25 when he went into the position. By the time he left, there was 150. That's a 500% increase. So, you know, we won't take lectures from the Conservatives, for example, on this problem. This is what we've inherited, and we're working hard to fix it, but it will take time.
That's not the problem. You've identified the wrong problem. We aren't bringing these people. The Conservative government wasn't bringing people over.
You allowed them to happen. It was open borders under the Conservatives.
No, the substantive problem is here that they're being housed in a hotel where the local community and local people are not being consulted.
Why, Nadine? Why are they having to be housed? They're having to be housed because of your open borders, because of your failure at the Home Office, because of your government's failure to process migrants quick enough to not have to use hotels. We've had a 20%
arrived under your watch.
We've had 20%
They arrived
increase
under
on
your watch and have been taken to Altrincham.
We've had 20% increase on deportations.
You had a responsibility to consult local people. That's the very least you could do, and that is normal practice before you put 300 people in a local community.
We didn't say that under the Conservatives, and it has been said in that report that the council were informed there.
I mean,
no, the council leader was informed, nobody else.
She said, Gwyneth Roper, that she'd written to Yvette Cooper. Is it acceptable just to say, you're not a constituent, I'm not interested?
That is actually the process.
Okay.
A Home Secretary cannot respond to willy-nilly to anybody across the country. There is a process for doing
it needs to go to the department email.
She will get I got thousands of emails a day. How on earth would you expect her to respond? I'm not the first person to run out and defend Yvette Cooper.
Well, hang on, Susie?
The reason that I suspect that they haven't consulted anybody is because they think they're going to be anti and say no. And when they don't consult anybody, they become more anti and are more likely to say no. The fundamental reason why we have any kind of problem whatsoever with asylum seekers in hotels is because David Blunkett, in the last Labour government, made it illegal for asylum seekers to work, and at a stroke
we didn't have this problem in 2018, so I don't know how you're blaming the last Labour government.
Crisis under David Blunkett, that's why he was acting on it. And at a stroke, it made the asylum seekers the taxpayers' problem. They weren't able to fend for themselves, they weren't able to work for themselves, they weren't able to contribute taxes and become part of society and integrate while they were waiting for I'm still speaking, while their applications were being processed. And as a result, we had to have more social housing, we had to have more benefits, we've had to have hotels because the social housing's been cut by the Conservatives.
We don't want to
let me just get back to
clearly we haven't met the demand to stop shouting about this issue. But I would say one thing, which is the inheritance. I'm happy to admit one of the things the Conservatives got wrong in the last government was immigration. Absolutely not. But what we have seen from this government is they've effectively rebranded the Stop the Boats with Smash the Gangs. they've got themselves into a complete tie-up about a Rwanda scheme because they now do want to re-establish one in Albania. They've scrapped Rwanda.
No, it is different, Patrick. It is different.
But it's an immigration policy that doesn't make much sense.
And on that, I'm afraid we haven't got any more time. Thank you to everybody here. And we're not shouting now. That's all. I'll be back on Monday with more. Bye-bye.